In the tense summer of 1914, Europe found itself standing on a precipice that few had genuinely anticipated. Although nationalism and imperial competition had been simmering for decades, many believed that diplomacy would keep outright war at bay. Yet an act of violence in Sarajevo, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary, unleashed a cascade of treaties and mobilizations. Neighboring nations summoned their armies under the well-rehearsed structures of entangled alliances. In a matter of weeks, what was once a localized conflict in the Balkans escalated into a continental and soon global struggle. Germany, bound by its obligations to Austria-Hungary, activated the legendary Schlieffen Plan, a strategy designed to avoid a two-front war by rapidly defeating France in the west before turning eastward against Russia. Still, the plan's success hinged on speed, precision, and assumptions that would soon be tested by reality. As hundreds of thousands of men mobilized with a mixture of excitement and dread, the whir of steam trains and the clang of rifles accompanied the final days of August 1914. In Germany, troops sang war songs, convinced that they would be in Paris in a matter of weeks. French soldiers in their bright red trousers and blue coats still drew upon the old Napoleonic pride, confident their national spirit and élan would bring them victory. The British Expeditionary Force, small but professional, crossed the English Channel with the sense of fulfilling a storied legacy, sure that their discipline would measure up to any continental foe. Across Europe, whole societies were thrown into upheaval. Families parted with their sons and husbands, while factories revved into overdrive, producing munitions and supplies. Although joy mingled with fear, nearly everyone believed that the fighting would conclude swiftly, perhaps by Christmas. Yet, as the German army marched through Belgium to outflank French defenses, a move that violated Belgian neutrality, the illusions of a quick, decisive campaign began to unravel. The Belgians put up fierce resistance in fortresses like Liège, slowing the Germans just enough to spark British outrage and galvanize the Allies. Though the Schlieffen Plan called for speed, the Belgian stand, combined with logistical hurdles, caused delays. French forces to the south, still enacting their own Plan Sext 7, launched aggressive offensives into Alsace-Lorraine. While these maneuvers led to significant casualties and operational confusion, they also laid the groundwork for what would become a pivotal confrontation near the banks of the Marne River. By the first days of September, Germany's vast right wing, commanded by General Alexander von Kluck, swept westward of Paris in the hopes of encircling and crushing the French. The French Fifth Army and the British Expeditionary Force, battered but unbroken, saw an opportunity for a counterstrike. The fields north and east of Paris were dotted with little villages and winding roads, which became arteries for troop movements. French Commander-in-Chief Joseph Joffre, initially criticized for his earlier missteps, now demonstrated unyielding resolve. His plan, exploit the gap that had opened up between the German First and Second Armies. In these crucial days, the destiny of France lay in the balance. Paris itself was threatened, and the government had already relocated to Bordeaux in anticipation of a possible occupation. Still, the spirit of resistance lingered, fueled by patriotism and desperation. Civilians provided assistance in every conceivable form. It was in this spirit that General Joseph Gallieni, the military governor of Paris, made a fateful decision. Commandeering taxis from the streets of Paris to shuttle reinforcements to the front lines, an act that would become emblematic of French resolve. As dawn broke over the Marne region on a crisp September morning, the armies arrayed themselves in a grand tableau of men, horses, artillery, and hope. Miles of trenches were not yet the defining feature of the war. Open maneuver was still possible. The rattling of carts, the bark of artillery fire, and the steady cadence of marching boots created a cacophony of war. In the distance, church bells still tolled, signaling another day, each ring incongruously blending with the instruments of destruction. German troops, confident from their earlier victories, advanced methodically, yet now faced logistical challenges. Supply lines were stretched to their limits, and the soldiers were weary from weeks of forced marches. On the Allied side, the British Expeditionary Force under Sir John French had recovered from its earlier engagements at Mons and Le Cateau, steeled by the knowledge that defeat here might mean the fall of Paris. Meanwhile, French generals Franchet d'Espèrey and Foch coordinated complex movements, each determined to hold ground and strike back. Amid this grand orchestration, individual stories multiplied by the thousands. A French infantryman, newly called from his rural village, found himself scanning the horizon for enemy units. He carried an old photograph of his wife and children, praying for the chance to see them again. A German artillery officer, once a quiet academic, wrestled with the moral enormity of his job. Though he never questioned the orders to fire upon advancing Allied units, he dreaded the faces he might see through the scope of his binoculars, a fleeting glimpse of the humanity he was tasked with destroying. British cavalry officers, with a flair reminiscent of the Victorian era, struggled to adapt to a battlefield dominated by modern firearms. And in the muddy trenches that were quickly forming, men huddled together, exchanging cigarettes and stories, forging unexpected bonds that transcended language. As the first shots of what would come to be known as the First Battle of the Marne echoed across the fields, the Allies unleashed a counter-offensive aimed at the German flank. The German First Army under von Kluck had swung east of Paris rather than encircling it from the west, as the original plan dictated. This change, of course, created a gap between the First and Second Armies, a gap Joffre and Gallieni were determined to exploit. Orders flew across telegraph wires, carried by dispatch riders who bravely navigated roads under fire. While the German command struggled to maintain tight coordination across its extended front, Allied forces concentrated on turning a precarious defense into a strategic opportunity. Everywhere, the staccato of rifle fire melded with the rumble of artillery. The smell of gunpowder hung heavily in the late summer air. Perhaps the most iconic episode of these dramatic days was the so-called Miracle of the Marne, in which columns of Parisian taxis ferried roughly 6,000 soldiers to the front. Though the actual strategic impact of the taxis has been debated by historians, their symbolic value was incalculable. Here was a moment where everyday civilian life seamlessly merged with the fate of a nation. Taxi drivers, once engaged in routine city traffic, now found themselves transporting heavily armed soldiers wearing expressions of determination or anxiety, or sometimes both. Spectators lined the streets to cheer, wave flags, and offer last-minute provisions. It was a momentary scene of unity amidst the horrors of war, each taxi representing a bright spark of hope against an expanding darkness. By September 6th, the Allies launched broad attacks along a line that extended for miles. The French Sixth Army engaged the German right flank northeast of Paris, while the British Expeditionary Force and the French Fifth Army also pressed forward. German troops, surprised to find themselves not at the gates of Paris, but instead grappling with a fierce foe, dug in as best they could. Von Kluck realized too late that his turn away from Paris had exposed his army's flank. German reserves rushed to close the gap, and furious engagements erupted near the Ourcq River. Fields of wheat and poppies, once a picturesque symbol of the French countryside, were transformed into battlefields soaked with sweat, blood, and shattered hopes. Soldiers dug shallow trenches, seeking shelter behind whatever ridges or embankments they could find. Amid the carnage, courage and desperation went hand in hand. Attacks often stalled, resulting in heavy casualties on both sides. Infantrymen crawled through tall grass, rifles at the ready, the pounding in their chests as loud as the artillery shells overhead. Overburdened medics scrambled to save the wounded, improvising field hospitals in farmhouses or under makeshift canvas shelters. The constant scream of shells tormented horses, which bolted or stumbled, adding a layer of chaos that neither side fully controlled. Close-quarter combat sometimes erupted when bayonet charges broke through defensive lines. turning farmland into a swirling mix of confusion and terror. Yet, out of this maelstrom, the Allied forces gradually gained momentum. Perhaps the most defining characteristic of the battle was the leadership choices made under intense pressure. Joffre, his calm demeanor concealing iron determination, issued the now famous General Order No. 5, demanding that any ground lost be retaken at once and that the troops hold fast. Gallieni, orchestrating reinforcements from Paris, displayed remarkable adaptability in the face of chaos. In the German High Command, the need for swift coordination became painfully apparent. Communication delays and the complexities of moving large formations by foot and rail across variable terrain hampered the rapid execution of plans. Each day brought new instructions and urgent pleas for reinforcements. Yet the synergy that had guided the initial German advance began to fade, replaced by an uneasy sense that things were spiraling out of control. Among the German ranks, exhaustion and uncertainty weighed heavily. Commanders looked over their maps, grappling with the reality that Paris had not fallen as predicted. Logistical failures surfaced, particularly shortages of ammunition and food. Soldiers went hungry or resorted to foraging from local farms, creating friction with civilians. Morale, once bolstered by the dream of a swift victory parade in the French capital, started to erode. Meanwhile, the Allies felt a resurgence of spirit. Though battered, they sensed that the tide was turning, and each incremental gain revitalized a determination that had been shaken by early defeats. Civilians who had once expected German troops to march into Paris now whispered of a possible salvation for the city. For nearly a week, the battle raged across a front that stretched over 100 miles. Night brought little relief. Flares illuminated the sky, and artillery barrages continued intermittently, breaking the illusion that darkness could provide safety. Soldiers slept in fragments, catching moments of rest in muddy ditches or under trees, never quite free from the fear of sudden ambush. The strain was palpable. Rifles jammed, boots wore out, and men questioned how long they could hold on. Even so, they pressed forward, driven by orders, comradeship, and raw survival instinct. On many occasions, small squads found themselves isolated from the main force, forced to navigate enemy territory with little more than a compass and courage. Some stumbled into captivity, while others rejoined their units to fight another day. Close to the center of the Allied line, General Ferdinand Foch, commanding the Ninth Army, became a notable figure of perseverance. When parts of his line threatened to collapse under German pressure, he famously declared, "My center is giving way, my right is in retreat. Situation excellent. I attack." Although some question the exact wording of this quote, the sentiment remains emblematic of the gritty determination that held the Allies together. Through relentless counterattacks, they prevented a total German breakthrough. Meanwhile, the German Second Army found itself overstretched, forced to pivot to address threats that emerged on multiple fronts. The weather, initially favorable, began to shift. Rain threatened to turn roads into quagmires, complicating the movement of men and artillery. Each day seemed to shrink the possibilities of a swift German victory, substituting illusions of grandeur with the grim reality of attrition. As September wore on, a sense of culmination enveloped the battlefield. Both sides recognized that the next series of engagements could decide the fate of nations. In small towns near the front, windows were shattered and church spires bore scars from shell splinters. Horses lay dead by the roadside, a grim testament to the unrelenting pace of modern warfare. Volunteers tried to bury the dead whenever possible, but often fighting resumed before they could finish, leaving the fields dotted with hastily marked graves. In the midst of so much tragedy, fleeting moments of compassion emerged. During lulls, soldiers sometimes aided wounded enemies, offering water or rudimentary medical care. A shared humanity remained, even if the broader conflict overshadowed it. Eventually, the cumulative weight of Allied pressure began to push the German armies back. Realizing that their right flank was in jeopardy and that retreat might be necessary to avoid encirclement, German High Command issued orders to withdraw to the Yssine River, roughly 40 miles north. The sense of shock was profound. Soldiers who had marched confidently into France under the banner of a lightning victory now trudged back, their exhaustion deepened by the knowledge that the campaign had not gone as planned. For the Allies, the German retreat was not simply a battlefield success. It represented the survival of France itself. Jubilant, yet wary, they followed the withdrawing Germans cautiously. By the second week of September, the lines stabilized north of the Aisne, setting the stage for an entirely new type of war, one characterized by trench lines that would ultimately span from the Swiss frontier to the North Sea. Reflecting on the monumental scope of the First Battle of the Marne, historians would later call it the decisive turning point that prevented a quick German victory in the West. Over 2 million soldiers participated in the battle, and casualties were staggering, with hundreds of thousands killed, wounded, or missing. Yet the human cost went beyond statistics. Entire families were ripped apart. Towns and villages that had once thrived on agriculture and trade now lay ravaged, needing years of recovery. Medical services struggled to cope with the sheer volume of injured men, introducing an era of modern wartime medicine that included innovative surgical techniques and the widespread use of motorized ambulances. For many, the Marne signaled the end of any romantic notion of war. It was a crucible of fire that foreshadowed the grueling trench warfare and industrial-scale killing that would define World War I. Still, amidst the sorrow and devastation, the Allies recognized in their victory a glimmer of hope. National pride surged in France. The invaders had been repelled at the very doorstep of Paris. The British, though relatively small in number during these early months, had proven their mettle and forged deeper cooperation with French forces. Even Russia, despite suffering its own setbacks on the Eastern Front, sensed that Germany's concentration of forces in the West had not achieved its intended knockout blow. With the war now settling into a stalemate of trenches, barbed wire, and machine gun nests, the strategic balance shifted. Germany was forced to reevaluate its entire approach, while France braced for a lengthy fight, determined to defend every inch of its soil. In the immediate aftermath, the French press hailed Joffre and Gallieni as heroes, praising their calm leadership under extraordinary stress. Gallieni's commandeering of taxis became a legendary anecdote, a symbol of French ingenuity and civilian resolve. Though historians debate the extent to which these taxis influenced the outcome, the episode captured the imagination of a nation seeking reasons to believe in eventual triumph. Meanwhile, German leaders faced criticism from some who believed that the Schlieffen Plan had been poorly executed or hastily altered. Yet the war was far from over. Germany dug in along the Aisne River, fortifying positions that would become part of the extensive trench systems. Both armies, having experienced the shock of modern warfare, looked ahead to a long and grueling conflict. For the soldiers who had lived through the Marne, the memories remained vivid and haunting. Letters sent home spoke of the heartbreak of losing friends, the ear-shattering thunder of artillery, and the fields that seemed forever changed by the footprints of war. Over and over, references to mud, blood, and the smell of cordite stained their pages. Many expressed relief at surviving such an inferno, while others struggled to reconcile their sense of duty with the horrors they had witnessed. Parents, wives, and children read these letters with a mixture of anxiety and relief. For those who had no letters, the silence was deafening. Families scoured casualty lists published in newspapers, praying not to see familiar names. In the broader world, the significance of the First Battle of the Marne resonated deeply. Neutral observers saw the shift from a swift war of movement to a grinding stalemate of entrenched lines. Diplomatic circles buzzed with speculation. If Germany had captured Paris, would the French government have negotiated a quick peace? Could Britain and Russia have mustered enough resolve to continue fighting? The hypothetical scenarios multiplied, but reality was clear. With the Marne, the Allies shattered Germany's hope of a rapid conquest. The next phase of the war would be a protracted struggle, requiring total mobilization of economies, societies, and psyches. Entire industries would convert to producing shells, bullets, and rifles, while the civilian populations braced for shortages, rationing, and the creeping shadow of grief. In the broader world, the significance of the First Battle of the Marne resonated deeply. Neutral observers saw the shift from a swift war of movement to a grinding stalemate of entrenched lines. Diplomatic circles buzzed with speculation. If Germany had captured Paris, would the French government have negotiated a quick peace? Could Britain and Russia have mustered enough resolve to continue fighting? The hypothetical scenarios multiplied, but reality was clear. With the Marne, the Allies shattered Germany's hope of a rapid conquest. The next phase of the war would be a protracted struggle, requiring total mobilization of economies, societies, and psyches. Entire industries would convert to producing shells, bullets, and rifles, while the civilian populations braced for shortages, rationing, and the creeping shadow of grief. In a single battle, the Old World, where wars were often decided by one grand campaign or a series of swift maneuvers, gave way to an era defined by trenches, attrition, and industrial might. Machine guns and barbed wire became the hallmarks of a new kind of conflict. While the First Battle of the Marne did not yet reveal the full brutality of trench warfare, it undeniably marked a turning point in the nature of the fighting. No longer could any side entertain the fantasy of a rapid conclusion. The stark reality set in. The war would be long, and it would change the face of Europe forever. Yet within the darkness, sparks of human endurance and compassion continued to glow. Stories emerged of soldiers from both sides who, when encountering an enemy wounded on the battlefield, offered help at great personal risk. Field chaplains conducted prayers and last rites for men of all faiths. Local villagers, having fled the oncoming storm, returned to pick up the pieces of their shattered homes, often assisted by soldiers temporarily billeted among them. Even as suspicion and enmity dictated most interactions, moments of shared humanity persisted. These small acts of kindness were overshadowed by the enormity of the conflict, but they remained as testaments to the fact that war, however inhumane, could not completely eradicate compassion. As word of the Marne's outcome spread throughout the Allied nations, a wave of cautious optimism set in, celebrations mixed with sorrow for the fallen. Many recognized that this was only the beginning of a struggle that could drag on indefinitely, but for the moment, the Marne was a reason to believe that Germany's strategy had been thwarted. The defense of Paris became part of French national identity, etched alongside the memory of past victories dating back to Napoleon's era. The British public, initially ambivalent about continental entanglements, now rallied more solidly behind the war effort. In a sense, the Allies had proven that unity and determined resistance could defy a seemingly unstoppable force. In Germany, reactions were more complicated. Official statements minimized the significance of the withdrawal, framing it as a minor readjustment of lines. But soldiers returning from the front, wounded or on leave, shared disheartening stories of the fierce resistance they had faced. The myth of an unbreakable German advance frayed. Still, the German war machine would continue to push in other directions, and the conflict would soon expand with new alliances and theaters of operation, from the Ottoman Empire's entry into the war to battles fought in distant colonies. The Great War, as it would come to be called, was unfolding on a scale unprecedented in human history, and the First Battle of the Marne was but one chapter, albeit a crucial one. As the front lines settled along the Aisne, the race to the sea began, with both sides attempting to outflank each other to the north. This maneuvering would define the next phase of the war in the west, culminating in a continuous line of trenches stretching from the Swiss border to the North Sea. Over the coming months, each army dug deeper into fortified positions, employing sappers, engineers, and an ever-growing arsenal of artillery. The territory that changed hands remained minimal, yet the cost in human life soared. The Marne had signaled the end of grand illusions and the start of a deadlock that would ultimately claim millions of lives. Yet, in reflecting on those critical days in early September 1914, one can find a snapshot of the paradoxes of war. The same conflict that showcased strategic brilliance and heroic sacrifice also revealed failures of leadership and the madness of industrial killing. It bound men together in the trenches, forging unbreakable bonds, even as it tore apart families and entire nations. For the French, it became a rallying cry, a reaffirmation that France would not surrender to foreign invasion. For the British, it solidified their role as a key player on the continental stage. For the Germans, it was a rude awakening that forced the recalibration of a plan that had been years in the making. In the years after the war, veterans who had fought at the Marne would gather for reunions, reliving the surreal mixture of terror and camaraderie that marked those days. Memorials and cemeteries were erected, each white cross or simple wooden plaque telling a silent story of a life cut short. Historians pored over battle maps, diaries, and official communiques, seeking to understand how such a massive encounter could come down to crucial decisions made in the heat of the moment. The phrase, "miracle on the Marne," entered textbooks and popular imagination, symbolizing how a nation's collective will, civilians, soldiers, and commanders alike, could turn the tide against a seemingly invincible foe. Today, the fields along the Marne River are largely tranquil. Vineyards thrive, villages bustle with local life, and tourists visit monuments commemorating the fallen. It is hard to imagine the thunder of artillery and the screams of charging infantry echoing across the same land. Time has softened the scars, but the lessons remain. The First Battle of the Marne stands as a testament to the unpredictable nature of war, the resilience of nations, and the heavy price of ambition. It reminds us that swift invasion plans can unravel under tenacious resistance, and that an entire war can hinge on pivotal days where leadership, logistics, and morale converge in a fragile balance. Though overshadowed by later battles of even greater carnage, Verdun, the Somme, Passchendaele, the Marne retains a special place in the annals of World War I. It was there that the massive German war machine first tasted the bitterness of strategic defeat, and it was there that Allied cooperation began to cement. As the war would grind on for 4 more years, the seeds planted at the Marne shaped the eventual outcome. Millions who would later fight in muddy trenches, dodge poison gas attacks, and endure long winters on meager rations owed their fates to the outcome of these critical September days. Conversely, the bravery and sacrifice displayed on the Marne became an enduring emblem of hope in the face of overwhelming odds. Even now, over a century after those tumultuous events, the echoes of the First Battle of the Marne reverberate through military scholarship and collective memory. Historians debate whether its significance lay in a fundamental shift in tactics or in demonstrating the resolve of Allied forces. Others view it as a story of missed opportunities for Germany, or as an inevitable collision of massive armies that had long been preparing for war. But what remains clear is that the Marne was more than just a strategic pivot. It was a defining moment in modern history. It illustrated both the destructive power of industrialized armies and the resilience of nations that refused to yield. It showed how close France came to succumbing, and how a combination of leadership, sacrifice, and sheer luck altered the course of the Great War. And so the story endures, woven into the tapestry of global memory. It speaks to the unpredictable nature of human conflict, that even the most meticulously crafted strategies can fail when met by determined resistance, and that ordinary individuals, from taxi drivers in Paris to foot soldiers in the trenches, can become the linchpins of history. The First Battle of the Marne was not a single clash, but a series of interwoven engagements that tested the spirit and resolve of entire nations. It was an episode where desperation and ingenuity combined to produce a pivotal result, reminding the world that, in war, as in life, destiny often hinges on the choices made in moments of profound crisis. From the vantage point of the present, we can look back on those desperate days in 1914 with a mixture of awe and sorrow. The men who fought there stood at the threshold of modern warfare, pioneers of a grim era that would redefine global politics and reshape the map of Europe. Their victory and defeat alike carried immense consequences. Yet, in their stories, we find not only tragedy, but also the capacity for bravery, resilience, and unity. The First Battle of the Marne remains etched in history as a testament to how a resolute stand on the eve of potential disaster can indeed shift the course of a colossal conflict. It serves as a solemn reminder that, in the crucible of war, human will and cooperation can sometimes achieve the unthinkable, forging hope even in the darkest hours. In the end, that is the legacy of the Marne, an inflection point where the unstoppable tide was slowed and then turned back, granting the Allies the chance to fight another day. It was a moment that underscored the interplay between meticulous planning and battlefield improvisation, between national fervor and the stark realities of combat, between the strategy of generals and the grit of the common soldier. Long after the cannons fell silent, the river flows on, its waters carrying the memory of a battle that altered the trajectory of the 20th century and forged a lasting chapter in the vast chronicle of human conflict.